The conference has been muted.
All right, let's go ahead and get started. So I'd like to welcome everybody to today's webinar, What's New in VMware vSphere v6 and Virtual SAN v6. I'd like to take a few minutes to go through some housekeeping items. During today's webinar, all of your phones will be muted, as you just heard. If you have questions, please enter them into the chat box, and we will answer them during the question and answer portion of the webinar. And now let's go ahead and get started. I'd like to introduce Ken Willard and Paul Jensen.
Good morning or afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. Paul, you want to do a quick intro and then hand back to me, and then I'll take off with the first few slides. All right, looks like we may have Paul on mute, so I'll go ahead and get started here. Are you there?
Sorry about that, Ken. Yes, I thought I had hit mute and unmute, and it evidently didn't come through. So I'll go ahead, unless you'd like to get started. I just had started with, my name's Paul Jensen. I'll do a brief intro. I'm one of Avnet's VMware certified instructors, and I'm here to help answer any questions and support Ken as he's going to be taking the lead in this particular presentation. But we're both here to help you gain a better understanding of some of the new features of vSphere and vSAN version 6.
Thank you, Paul. And again, my name is Ken Willard. I am also one of Avnet Academy's VMware certified instructors. So we'll get started here. We're going to walk through first some of the main platform features that have changed, and then we'll start digging deeper into the various aspects of vSphere, and then transition in the last half of the conversation to the virtual SAN discussion. VMware continues to grow the vSphere product to support those larger and larger environments as needed. For many of us, that's not really necessarily the environment that we need to support. But the nice thing about this is we know that as our environment grows, the VMware scalability is going to be there to match what we need. So lots of increases with this version. From the 5.5 version, we've doubled the cluster size and the number of VMs supported per cluster, as well as doubling the number of VMs we support per host. And then if we look at some of the virtual machine specific things down there at the bottom, we've also doubled the number of virtual CPUs we support per host or per VM, as well as doubling the amount of virtual machine memory that we can allocate. So lots of growth capability here to support even very large enterprise application hosting if we would need to. Specific to what we can do with virtual machines, some of the new features here in ESXi 6. We already mentioned the increase in virtual machine CPU and memory capacity. We also now have the ability to do virtual NUMA-aware hot adding of memory. So as we grow memory on demand, we're getting that NUMA-centric better performance, as well as new graphics features, new controllers specific to OS X if you're running some virtualized OS X in the environment, as well as both an expansion of the maximum number of serial ports allowed, or the ability to simply completely remove the serial and parallel ports if that's not something you use in your virtual machine environment. just a little more growth and control capability there. So that is really the high level. Let's start talking about some of the specifics. As we look at the management platform and what vCenter does for us, one of the big changes here with version 6 is complete parity between a Windows-hosted virtual center and the virtual appliance. So there used to be some discrepancies between those two versions. Now they are exactly the same so far as scalability in the number of hosts, the number of VMs, all of those types of metrics that we support inside of vCenter. So you can now make the decision on which version of vCenter you want to run, less about the scalability options and more about the other operations that are happening inside of your enterprise. Paul, if you want, this is one of the areas that when we had walked through the conversation earlier this week, you had sort of hit on a few points. If you don't mind, I'll sort of put you on the spot here. We didn't prep this, but if you want to talk a little bit about the platform services controller and the differences in 6.
Sure. So with the deployment of 6, VMware has moved away from decoupling everything and doing a separate install for, as you can see, single sign-on, licensing, your vCenter server, your inventory service. Those are now bundled, if you will, into 2 different containers. We have the platform services controller, which is what we're talking about here. With that, you're bundled your single sign-on, your license, and something that is a little newer. We've had a certificate capability, but the certificate authority is one of the newer features of this particular deployment. VMware still does allow you to deploy everything on one single system, the embedded deployment as it states here, or you can do an external or a distributed deployment with the single sign-on server as a secondary system, or the first system you really hit with the web client for authentication, which gives you a little bit better capabilities as far as high availability, those types of things, to have multiple platform services controllers or have one control more than one vCenter, as is shown here.
Thank you, sir. So again, just growing out that sort of simplifying the management while hopefully growing the scalability processes. Just waiting here a minute for the slide to advance. We've got a few slides here around vMotion and the services. One of the things that we'll see here is an enhancement. We now have the ability to do a cross-switch vMotion. Those of you that have been working with the product for a while, you're probably well aware of some of the constraints that we had, particularly in the networking, to make sure that we had naming conventions consistent and those types of things. We now have the ability to do cross-switch vMotion activities. So that allows us to change network or change virtual networks as we're going through the vMotion. The one really important thing to note here is, I think, sort of the first major bullet and then the third major bullet here. So this all happens transparently to the guest OS of that virtual machine as we go through the transition and change those virtual switch assignments. No data about that is passed into the guest OS. And that also means that we don't do anything to change the IP address of the virtual machine during the process of the vMotion. So while it does give us some flexibility if we might have an environment where we have some different naming conventions across the host for some reason, that type of thing, it does require us to have consistent IP scheming accessible to that VM as we go through the vMotion activity. And we'll see that's a consistent theme here coming up. So not only can we do cross-switch vMotion at this point, but we can also do cross vCenter vMotion as we get the slides to move here. So this gives us the ability to change the target compute, storage network, and the vCenter that's responsible for managing the virtual machine, all during the single vMotion action. So depending on your use case, and we can see this happening in a local data center, but we might be moving a virtual machine, say, from one rack environment to another. We might see this happening if we were in a metro environment where we had data centers maybe on opposite ends of metro area network. Or we could even see this happening in much broader vMotion action, moving that virtual machine inside of our overall architecture. So growing that flexibility and capability that we get inside of vMotion. And then the last one is a topic that VMware's been talking about for a few years. This actually, I think, Paul, you can help check me on this. I think the first time we might have seen this concept was at VMworld about 4 years ago. And we've now continued to expand the support for this concept of long-distance vMotion. You see we've got pretty good flexibility here. We're tolerating up to 150 millisecond round-trip latency here. So relatively flexible here in the connectivity between the two endpoints. And obviously the concept of a permanent migration is probably the most common thing that we think about. And then I've heard folks talk about using this to do multi-site load balancing. So as you begin to reach capacity limits in the Phoenix data center, we might move it to the New York data center or something like that. And then, of course, this middle option is disaster avoidance. If we know we have a natural disaster that's pending, so that hurricane that's well offshore or that wildfire that might encroach upon the area of the data center, those types of things, we can take advantage of the long-distance vMotion behaviors and use that to completely evacuate a data center in advance of some kind of a pending disaster. So another step in providing us both good load balance, resource usage sort of scenarios, as well as the ability to use this as a tool in our highly available, high uptime operations as well. And Paul, I'll give you a little more lead time here. I'm going to get you queued up. If you want to talk a little bit about the content library.
Sure. So one of the new features of vSphere 6, obviously, that has been brought in from the vCloud Director arena is this concept of a content library. The content library, one of the great things about this, there's a lot of things here, as you can see. It's a central repository for all of your templates, VApps, ISOs, scripts. But one of the really great benefits of this is you can share this content. So if you've got that distributed environment where you may have multiple vCenters, multiple locations, you can actually share and have a single repository control point of your template. So you know that your base images, things like that, are going to be consistent across your distributed environment. So some really neat capabilities there. We'll probably see some additional growth as more features are introduced, but that's, I would say content libraries in a nutshell. So, Ken, if you want to go ahead and I think we've got move on to the move on to the next. So, do you want to take this one, Ken, or would you like me to continue?
Oh, feel free. We'll go back and forth with these.
Sure. So another thing that has seen a lot of improvements is our clients, VMware's different clients. So we have two clients: the standard, traditional, if you will, vSphere thick client, or the vSphere client, and the web client. You'll see a lot of things are changing here. The web client can do almost everything that the thick client can. We still need the thick client for doing patching using Update Manager. However, any of our new features, anything that has to do with hardware versions, 8 through 10, anything basically from 5.5 and later, all of those new features are only going to be available and exposed into the web client. So again, the thick client is still here. We're still supporting it. It's out there. Again, features, 5.1 and later, are only going to be available in that web client. Although you can actually look at virtual hardware versions 10 and 11, you won't have any ability to actually edit those settings. So if you have newer virtual machines to take advantage of some of those newer features, newer sizing capabilities, they won't be able to be completely edited in through the web or through the thick client. Now, the first question that pops up generally is, well, I like all these new features, but I've used the web client. It's had some performance, things coming on. vCenter, VMware has really optimized the web client. So you'll notice, and we'll show you a few things coming up here, some great improvements in login time when you click things, much improved menuing systems, just a much better layout and organization of the web client. So again, VMware went through and on a screen-by-screen basis completely redid the code and optimized the code. Just a real quick look, you can see the previous version is the blue. Length of time it took to access various things, host clusters, the different menuing system. And the orangish color there is the advantages or the improvements that were made to the web client. Ken, if you would like to take over coming up on networking, unless you have something additional you would like to pull up here.
Not at all. Happy to pull this back. So the networking conversation, we've got networking and storage new features coming up here. And for each of those, the conversations are actually fairly condensed. We have just one slide on each of those. So from the networking perspective, we have new features in the network I/O control. So we now have the ability to do bandwidth reservations to help with quality of service and service level guarantees. We can apply those at the virtual NIC level. So that lets us begin to tailor the reservation management to a specific virtual machine. Or we can also apply those at the distributed port group level. So if we had say, a collection of virtual machines that were supporting a specific application or a specific workflow within our organization. We could do the bandwidth reservation at the port group level, and that would let us handle that as a broader scope management bucket for that collection of VMs that were attached to the distributed port. So just a few refinements or enhancements around the way network I/O controls are allocated in vSphere version 6. And then for the storage conversation, we have some enhancements around storage I/O controls as well. So we can now take advantage of the capabilities that the array can give us through the VASA provider that's contained inside the array. And any time that we can hand off those tasks from the ESXi host to the array, we get a little bit of performance improvement, plus we're minimizing that workload on the ESXi hosts every chance we get. So we can now take advantage of array-based thin provisioning, deduplication, auto-tiering, and snapshot behaviors, and those can all be taken advantage through DRS. So storage DRS knows how to use those with those VASA-capable storage enclosures. We also have some expanded support around Site Recovery Manager. For those of you that are using SRM to handle your disaster recovery and management processes, we now have awareness of our consistency groups inside of Site Recovery Manager. And then you see down here at the bottom, the last thing that I really want to call out on this slide is the ability to do IOPS reservations on a per disk basis. And again, this is handled through the API communicating with the storage array. That gives us that very fine-grained control to do performance tuning and give those IOPS reservations on a per disk management level. So those are sort of the two high-level conversations, enhancements in network I/O control and then enhancements in storage control. But if any of you have had a chance to look through any of the material for vSphere version 6 storage specifically, you know that virtual volumes are one of the big topics of conversation. So virtual volumes let us begin to simplify that management of our external storage arrays. And this works whether we're talking about SAN appliances or NAS appliances. And it lets us begin to get better control with VM level storage operations, as well as taking advantage of software-defined data center practices by taking advantage of storage-based management or policy-based storage management. When you see here, the vVols work on top of all of the I/O protocols, whether it's Fiber Channel, iSCSI, or NFS. And this is included as part of the vSphere code. So you'll have this right out of the box. So if we look at how vVols start to impact the management operations, the virtual infrastructure administrator, your vSphere admin teams, are going to be able to have those granular data services applied on that per VM, per VMDK basis. Lets us have very easy capacity provisioning and compliance monitoring with the vVol architecture. So really helping with storage management simplification from the virtual infrastructure perspective. From the perspective of the storage admin teams, which are frequently very different teams within organizations, that lets them help with virtual machine service level compliance, eases the access and control security processes that they have to manage. So once you've got the vVol architectures in place, we're really working to reduce that management burden and overhead for the teams while giving them better controls and more quality of service capabilities. So Paul, I know you just had a little bit of a module, but if Game, I'd like to have you walk through some of the vVol slides here.
Sure. So traditionally, as you've deployed VMware in your environments, from your storage side, you've had to have been presented a LUN by your storage admin. Now, sometimes the information on that LUN, as far as its features, settings, all of that was provided by your storage admin, sometimes maybe not so much. And you generally had to allocate those settings on a LUN-by-LUN basis. So as you can see here, we have kind of that whole gold, silver, bronze tier inside the array, and it's utilizing an entire LUN. So not necessarily the most efficient usage of that storage. One of the things vVol does is now we get provided the actual capabilities from the array of what we are able to do. And when we store a VM, we store it with those capabilities, that policy-based management as it states here. So no longer are we storing LUNs, we are storing the VMs directly to the array and allowing the array to handle that management. So as we look at this, what's happening here is we have our VMs, we have that concept of the storage policy-based management. We have a provider that tells us, the array tells us, as I mentioned earlier, what features it has, whether it does snapshotting, replication, these types of things. It connects through something called a protocol endpoint, and then we can store things out here onto the array itself in something called a storage container, just some terminologies. So this is where we store everything. That storage container can take up the entire array. No longer are we limited to the size because we're not dealing with the VMware file system or really any file system that specifically that we're dealing with here. VMware doesn't care what's going on there. So we connect in, we save the VMs, and we allow the array to place that VM where it needs to be to meet that storage-based policy management requirement that we've set. So by associating that with the VM, we select the array that it will go to, as we select that, when we're configuring it, and it will then take those requirements that we have selected from its capabilities, and it will store that VM out in the appropriate location. So some really neat capabilities. No longer on the VMware side do we really need to sit there and figure out what's going on in the array. Do we need to have all of these tiers? We get those provided to us, and we can simply create policies and save the VMs and allow the array where it should be to handle all of those features for us. So again, the whole concept here, the storage admin is in control. The storage admin selects the capabilities. What the various array vendors will select what capabilities they will publish out to VMware through the VASA APIs, through the APIs. And then we can create our policies based off of that. So again, I think this is really kind of a rehash of where we were at. We've got that a policy-based management. and what capabilities we're doing here. So some really neat capabilities to offload a lot of the management of the storage from the VMware admin side back to the storage admin, while giving the storage admin that control again, where they tend to be a little happier anyway. So, and pretty much all array vendors are, there's a huge, vast partner base that is set up for handling vVols already. Many arrays are even being updated to publish this information out and support this with VMware's partner base. So, Ken, do you have anything else to add, or would you, you want to go ahead and maybe take over HA?
Absolutely. Thank you, sir. Yeah, so again, we have a brief bit of conversation here on HA. We have one slide there, and then we'll get into a little bit of conversation on some of the new features in fault tolerance. Okay, just give the slide a minute to advance here. So the primary enhancement here is that HA is now has some awareness to handle path failures. So if we have a host that has a path failure, maybe the host is still up and running but not able to see the storage array, we can now restart those VMs on healthy hosts, working around the storage path failure that was impacting the previous host for that particular VM. So just another enhancement, another piece of HA that gets a little enhanced functionality there. So starting on into vSphere fault tolerance. If you've seen any of the press around vSphere, you know this is one of the major announcements. vSphere gives us that zero downtime experience that we have some systems that justify that sort of protection and coverage, where the highly available restart scenario just isn't good enough. But previously we had been limited to single virtual CPU configurations that we could protect with the fault tolerant solution. Now with version 6, we've expanded that. So if you have some of the standard license bundles with version 6, you have the ability to protect 2 virtual CPU VMs. And if you happen to be running at the Enterprise Plus license level, you can support up to 4 virtual CPU VMs with this zero downtime fault tolerant architecture. So major enhancement in the scalability and the support that fault tolerant can offer us here. Several changes here around the storage behaviors that work with fault-tolerant protected VMs. It used to be that we depended upon shared storage for accessing the fault-tolerant VM files. Now when we protect a virtual machine with vSphere fault tolerance, we'll actually make a second copy of the VM's files. So not only do we have that protection in case of something happening to the ESXi host, but if we had a virtual machine that was protected with fault tolerance and something happened with its supported storage, we would have a second full copy of the VM somewhere else. And then one of the other really critical things here is if you look at the side-by-side comparison of fault-tolerant capabilities, the second line here where it says virtual disks, We used to only support those thick provisioned eager zeroed virtual machine disks, so it was very high consumption. With the fact that we now are creating a second copy of all those VM files, vSphere 6 gives us a way to mitigate that additional storage being taken off of another volume because we can now do that with thin provision disks. So we no longer have that requirement of thick provision disks for fault-tolerant coverage. And then the last topic here, last little bit of conversation is around vSphere data protection. And then we'll get into talking about virtual SAN. Apologize for this. I'm just waiting on the slides to update. So if any of you have been using vSphere data protection, the big change here is that data protection in vSphere 6 now contains all the features and functionality that had been part of vSphere Data Protection Advanced in previous versions. So if you're not familiar with data protection, this gives us the ability to back up virtual machines. It is based upon the EMC Avamar technology. So once we have the first initial backup of that VM, we take advantage of the virtual SCSI change block tracking, and we in the future then just have to back up those changed blocks. So it's very, very efficient. And one of the big advantages to having all of the features that previously were included in Data Protection Advanced is the fact that there are some application-specific plugins for Outlook, SharePoint, that let us actually be application aware when we go to do the backups, and we can properly quiet those application systems to get static data sets to do our backups with. So we support up to 800 VMs per virtual center server. This is great for that remote office, branch office sort of scenario. And we do have the ability to scale this out and distribute the virtual appliances that manage the data protection processes. So we can have up to 20 of those per vCenter server. So great in the product way to do virtual machine backups. All right, let's transition from talking about vSphere overall, and let's start talking about virtual SAN 6.0 and some of the things that we have that are new to that. If you haven't done much work with virtual SAN, this is the native hypervisor-based converged storage. So if you've previously been familiar with the disk virtualization options, you know it was appliance-based. Today, this is a native part of the hypervisor and is as easy to configure as any of the other cluster-based services. You literally go in, check a checkbox, and then select your options that you want the virtual SAN to deploy with, and the ESXi hosts take care of setting up the rest of the configuration. It is a really, really easy configuration scenario. New to version 6 is this idea that we now have an all-flash architecture. So the way virtual SAN had worked before we had a solid state device, and then we backed that up with spinning disk. So the solid state device was used for cache purposes, and then the spinning disk was used for the volume storage purposes. To help support growing applications, very high transaction-based applications with the virtual SAN scenario, we now have an all-flash option. So this lets us write quickly to the solid state that is identified as cache, and then we go on to the capacity tier also, which is pure flash. So that gives us that 90,000 IOPS per host capability. Again, this helps VMware address those scalability, those high transaction enterprise applications with virtual SAN. So because we've been able to eliminate that virtual storage appliance that had been common in the virtual disk solution previous to virtual SAN, we've gotten much more efficiency. The virtual SAN architecture consumes less than 10% of the CPU resources on a host. And because it's all managed right from within the same cluster services, it's a very clean and easy management platform. So we talked on an earlier slide about the all-flash architecture. That's new to this version. With the all-flash architecture, we get those huge IOP numbers. In the 5.5 version of virtual SAN, we supported obviously only the maximum 32-node architecture that vSphere supported. With the growth in vSphere supported nodes to 64 in a cluster, we now support that for virtual SAN as well. We've also got some new availability features. So if you look under those enterprise data services, virtual SAN also now has some rack awareness. So we can now properly distribute data across racks, and that gives us some rack failure resiliency. As well as the hardware that we have on the hardware compatibility list continues to grow, so we continue to give you broader options in the hardware that we allow virtual SAN to deploy on. So just a few metrics about what folks have been able to achieve with virtual SAN and some of the performance benefits that have come. So you see there, depending on the environment, reduction in storage management time, improved latency, and an overall reduction in the footprint from a storage cost perspective. So lots of advantages to looking at virtual SAN in the environment. So much like we had the comparison for the vSphere versions, this gives you that side-by-side comparison for virtual SAN. So there you see the top line. Of course, we've done that build out the number of hosts supported. And then the big thing here is if you look at the IOPS per host, if we have that traditional virtual SAN hybrid model, so that is where we're using the solid state for cache, we're using the spinning disk for capacity. We've doubled the IOPS per host. And then if you look at the all-flash architecture, that's 4.5, almost 5 times the throughput per host. And the other thing is here you see a huge increase in the scalability of the virtual disk size from 2 terabytes up to the 64 terabyte new limit. that we have supported in Virtual SAN version 6. So that really wraps us on the what's new between vSphere and Virtual SAN, between the previous 5.5 and the new version 6. And so now, if we can get the slide deck to cooperate here, I want to talk just a brief minute about some of the things that we're doing specific with Avnet Academy around the new vSphere launch. So we already have on our public schedule the install, configure, and manage, and the optimize and scale classes, as well as some promotions around on-demand and learning zones. So all of our on-demand classes right now to sort of help promote the vSphere 6 launch are all 10% off, and that applies whether it's vSphere specific or not. And then if you've seen any of the announcements from VMware, we have a learning zone promotion that came out directly from VMware. This is an unlimited all-you-can-eat training option, and it is a one-year subscription, had been $1,000. They've now got a promotion out on that where it's $500 a year. And I worked with Jen Berry, who helped us put this program together. One of the things that we had as a little bit of a bonus for those of you that joined the presentation with us today and stuck with it all the way to the end, we had one of the team members work to do a random poll, and I will probably butcher the name, so I will apologize in advance, but Faisal Qureshi was selected. We have one of the Learning Zone subscriptions for a year to give away out of this presentation. So Faisal will be doing some follow-up after the presentation and getting you your Learning Zone subscription. And at that point, Jen, I think this takes us into the Q&A.
Awesome. Great presentation. All right, so I did get a couple of questions come in. Again, if you have any questions, please just go ahead and chat them over to me. And let me see. Are there licensing limitations or requirements to use any of the features discussed?
So a few of the features have some specific requirements. I mentioned around the fault tolerant feature of protecting 4 virtual CPU VMs requires Enterprise Plus. The virtual SAN that we talked about, that is an entirely separate licensed product from VMware, but it has been revved to be consistent with some of the vSphere 6 features. Paul, anything else that's specific license restricted that I missed?
I know that on the some of the storage features where it does mention storage DRS, which is also an Enterprise Plus license feature. I would say if you're looking for what features come with what particular license, still the best resource for that would be to go to VMware site, select vSphere, and then there is a compare link that will go, excuse me, and show you all of the different license features and what, or all the different features and what license they correspond to.
Great. And here's another one that came in. Since vVols are stored directly to the array, does that mean they replace raw device map disk?
Since I did vVols. So they're stored directly to the array, but they're still stored in a container, if you will. They're not directly. A raw device map is a LUN that is exposed directly to a VM. So No, they don't replace that. Any application you need that still needs direct access to storage is still going to need that raw device map or that RDM. So not quite the same. It does offer a lot of features, but that's not something that it'll replace.
Okay. And let's see, how difficult or easy is, oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, but before we got to the next question, the compare URL that Paul mentioned, I just put that into the chat window for all, so hopefully that was helpful for everybody.
Great, thank you. And one more, how difficult or easy is the V6 upgrade?
Well, that is certainly a loaded question. I will fall back to my instructor default answer for most questions in vSphere classes, and that answer is that it depends. You know, any upgrade, how hard or easy it is going to be based on the complexity of the environment that you're trying to get upgraded. I can tell you that the release notes for this particular version are the most substantial I've seen in a long time. So that probably indicates that this may be a bigger upgrade project for most organizations than maybe some of the previous versions have been. Without fail, obviously, you want to get through the release notes. You want to make sure that you've got good backup in place for not only the virtual machines, but make sure that you've got your vCenter, your vCenter database, all those types of things properly backed up. And then just start through that backup guide and make sure you're going step by step. So probably this one's maybe a little bigger than some of the others, but can certainly get through that. If any of you are familiar with Michael White, he has a great technical blog. It's one that I read. I'm pretty sure Paul reads on a pretty regular basis. And he has an upgrade discussion on his blog, so I've just posted that into the chat window for everybody as well. So that'll be a little follow-on for anybody that's interested in upgrades.
And then along the same lines, actually kind of got another question. Are there any pitfalls that should be factored into upgrade plans?
You know, for specific pitfalls, again, that sort of falls back to the it depends. Pitfalls follow the environment, so each one's going to be unique, and it's hard to come up with generic or universal things. I think one of the things that a lot of organizations can wind up not thinking about or skipping inadvertently, everybody goes through and they'll update the host, and they obviously update vCenter. Once you've done those, then more often than not, you're prompted to update your virtual machine tools. So those things usually get covered through the native process, but it's not required. There aren't often any prompts, and a lot of people don't always upgrade their virtual hardware for the virtual machines. And that doesn't necessarily cause any problems, but what it will mean is if there are new features that are capable by the new version of virtual hardware, you're missing out on some of those new features. So post-upgrade, you just might want to go through and do an audit, make sure that you've upgraded the virtual machine hardware as well so that you're getting the full return on your investment all the way through all the aspects of the virtualization layers. Paul, anything that I missed from a pitfalls or things to think about in the upgrade process?
No, not that I can think of. I do know that there is some really, in addition to that, VMware does have some really good documentation in their own documentation about doing the upgrades that mention a lot of different things that you definitely want to obviously review on top of just the release notes. So don't think I can't think of anything you missed.
Perfect.
Great. Well, just so everybody knows, we will send out the recording of this webinar to all of the attendees. So you will get to rewatch this if you have some information you want to go back for reference. Also, here's all of the contacts on there. Again, this will be included in the email, so you can reach out to Paul or Ken or anybody on the Academy team. And we'd just like to thank you guys all for attending today, and thank you, Paul and Ken, for presenting.
Thank you, Jen.
Thank you.
Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you. Please stand by.